Cultural appropriation is one of those very fun buzzwords that gets tossed around the internet quite often. Obviously, I meant that with a hint of sarcasm, but with Ubisoft being the delightful publisher that they are, and their latest Assassin's Creed game sparkling all sorts of controversies, now feels like the perfect time to discuss a game that's trying to replicate another country's culture and history, specifically the Wild West. It should come as no surprise that this isn't exactly a common setting. The only other example that comes to mind is Django, which, although I haven't played it yet, seems more like a Nitra Plus style visual novel with a spaghetti Western coat of paint. There's, however, one significant difference between something like Assassin's Creed Shadows and these untranslated VNs, which is that, due to their considerably smaller scope, they never directly reached an audience who could relate to the cultures the games were referencing. Today's game comes from the minds of Liarsoft, a developer I previously covered in this channel with my review of Evermaiden. Funnily enough, it looks like the reason behind making a Western-themed VN came out of cynical resignation. After the low sales of some of their earlier games like Pink Panther or Seifism no Gensu, they figured they might as well embrace their nicheness and make yet another potential failure, which honestly I can totally relate to. Hey there, this is Marin, and this is my review of Angel Bullet. The story begins when Sara Winters embarks on a journey to the Wild West to find his father, who went missing 5 years ago. However, her adventure quickly took a left turn when the train she's riding is hijacked by a gang of scoundrels. Prepared for trouble, she reaches for her guns to confront them. But just when she thinks she has the situation under control, their chief suddenly transforms into a werewolf, much to Sara's surprise. Her bullets were now completely ineffective against the thick skin of this supernatural creature. Fortunately for her, a slightly eccentric pastor on the train throws her a ring and urges her to use it. This ring contains a special type of magic that, when infused with her bullets, is capable of damaging any beast. After her much-fought victory, Sara demands an explanation from the priest. Apparently, the western part of America became rampart with all sorts of mysterious monsters, prompting the government to establish an order for extermination, relying on bounty hunters. Feeling a strong sense of justice and duty, Sara decides to become one of them. But to do so, she will need the help of the priest's magical ring. However, that ring has one peculiar flaw. It requires a specific type of stimulation to be recharged, something the priest is currently incapable of on his own due to his suffering of erectile dysfunction. Look, I'm not making this up. This is how the story goes, okay? But in an odd turn of events, after being physically and verbally abused by Sara, he felt something awaking in him, making her an indispensable partner for his endeavors. Thus, this oddly matched pair sets off on their journey to restore the peace of the Wild West. Or perhaps, more accurately said, a less chaotic state of the Wild West. If you were expecting a typical Western story, well, too bad. That's Liarsoft for you. Yet despite this unconventional approach, the game shines in its commitment to authenticity. The story is packed with references to both historical and fictional figures, as well as events that took place in real life. It's genuinely surprising how well-researched everything is, and it shows that the writer had a true appreciation for that historical era. At the same time, the game presents these elements in a fairly humorous way, often parodying most of what's referencing. Fourth wall breaks, like insisting they are talking in English, and other types of gags are commonplace in this narrative, and while they can be a bit vulgar at times, they work surprisingly well thanks to the chemistry of the cast. Out of them, it's worth highlighting the two protagonists, the intrepid Sara and the perverted priest, Klaus. Sara, in particular, serves as an excellent window to the narrative. Even though this is her first time visiting the West, she's well-versed in its legends and customs thanks to her love for dime novels. Though this has left her with a skewed and idealized view of the region's true form. It was fun seeing her constant disappointment whenever her oh-so-romanticized Wild West turned out to be something far cruder and cynical. She also made a great pair with the actual protagonist, Klaus. Their dynamic usually revolved around Klaus being disparaged and ridiculed for his depraved nature, while enjoying it as the masochist that he is. Nonetheless, their relationship still showed some depth, as the two of them slowly built a sense of trust as the story progressed. Aside from these two, the story featured three more characters who frequently accompanied the unusual duo on their adventures. Let's begin with Pearl, the daughter of the renowned bounty hunter Cole Younger. While not much of a fighter, her constant reprimanding of her father's disregard of the battle expenses added a nice comedic touch to both her persona and their peculiar father-daughter relationship. Next, there's Susan, another bounty hunter who quickly made a name for herself thanks to her sharpshooter skills. She had a very laid-back demeanor, but knew when to shift into seriousness when the situation called for it. As a veteran, she often poked fun at Sara's rookie mistakes, which never failed to irritate Sara. Finally, there's Flying Bird, a lone Native American girl who roamed the land, exercising spirits as a shaman. She was, in my opinion, the most interesting character of the story, perhaps even more so than the main duo. The game doesn't shy away from depicting the social turmoil between Native Americans and white people during the 19th century, but it doesn't overly dramatize it or make it sound preachy. Instead, it simply used that historical background to cleverly draw comparisons with the paranormal situation running rampant in this setting. What makes Flying Bird such an intriguing character is that, despite being explicitly shunned by certain individuals, she didn't hold a grudge against white people, nor against the beasts either. There were some scenes where she challenged the other members of the cast's perspectives, becoming a key factor for their personal growth. The main point that makes this group of characters so engaging is the variety and interconnectedness of their relationships. What I mean by this is that the interactions don't exclusively revolve around the protagonist, but instead it feels like there's a clear dynamic between each and every member of the cast. This makes all the main characters stand out on their own, something further reinforced by how they pop in and out of the narrative as they please. You see, in this game, each story chapter focuses on a different bounty, following a villain of the week type of approach. The thing is, you won't always get a full house of main characters in every chapter. They all have their own motives and personal agendas, making them, as well as the whole town, feel far more alive and real. It gives the story a sense that they are a ragtag group that join forces out of sheer inevitability, simply fumbling about, trying their best to make a living. As far as the bounties and their respective chapters, I must admit that they do slightly range in terms of quality. While the game does feature an overarching narrative, the amount of information given and its significance to the plot differ from chapter to chapter. As a result, certain parts of the story felt slightly like filler, causing the game to struggle to keep its momentum. Another factor in this might have been the intermissions between the chapters, which mostly served the purpose of offering slice-of-life scenes of the characters. Even so, I wouldn't consider any of that content to be bad. At the very least, it helped in enhancing the sense of world-building. Something else I enjoyed was how the plot gradually changed its overall tone, starting rather lighthearted but eventually becoming quite dark during its final chapters. This transition didn't feel like narrative whiplash thanks to the occasional hints of this duality, such as the bad endings that ended with an H scene, but those moments when it finally reaches its climax were honestly pure, unadulterated kino. It's a type of story that goes into unexpected places, but the strong chemistry of the cast and the gradual build-up made them hit that much harder. Maybe one of the weaker aspects of the game's structure was how it handled the individual routes. Although it was clear from the beginning that the story would primarily focus on Sara, there were still alternate endings for the other three main girls. However, these routes mostly consisted of a single different chapter inserted into the story before the final arc began, as well as the epilogue being slightly different. It was a bit disappointing that these characters didn't receive their own unique storylines, especially Flying Bird. Nevertheless, this approach made sense considering the type of narrative the story was aiming for, and the routes still led to some interesting and rather bittersweet endings. It has been a while since I included this section in a review, but indeed this game does have some gameplay elements to it, mostly in the vein of turn-based combat. How it works is that at certain points in the story, Sara will confront in one-to-one duels whichever villain she and Klaus were chasing. During these battles, your options are to either shoot with a regular or special shot or buff yourself. There's also a unique system that lets you interrupt an enemy attack if you time it right, at which point you can either choose to counterattack or avoid the enemy's move. However, they can do the same to you. I honestly thought there was potential in this gameplay system for an interesting rock, paper, scissors dynamic. There's only one big flaw. The game is absurdly easy. You could honestly completely turn off your brain, hit buttons at random, and still come out of battles unscathed. The main issue is how absurdly unbalanced the interrupt mechanic is. I haven't exactly measured how long the window for it is, but I'm fairly sure it gives you more than 3 seconds to react. I was hoping that perhaps, as the game progressed, the timing would tighten up, but even the final boss was a total breeze. The only slightly challenging aspect is that if you run out of magic, you could get stuck in an unwinnable battle since the meter doesn't recharge mid-battle. But as long as you don't use your magic attacks when you aren't supposed to, this is very unlikely. As for how you actually recharge it, right at the start of each chapter, there's a scene where Klaus asks the reluctant Sara to perform all sorts of acts. Gameplay-wise, there's not much to say here. You simply pick a card, then roll the dice, and if your number is higher than Sara's, you get an H scene. Most of these lean heavily into comedy, which is perhaps the only saving grace of this part. Although I kind of found amusing their anglicized version of Degesa and other Japanese words. Moving on to the presentation, the first thing that immediately caught my eye were the character designs. I really dig how they opted for a more realistic portrayal rather than sticking with the typical Mo art style. It fits the setting remarkably well. After doing some research, i.e., looking it up on VNDB, I found out that the character artist was Ayakura Ju, probably best known for his work in Spice and Wolf. Angel Bullet seems to be one of the very few +18 works he has been involved with, which gives this game its own uniqueness. Besides the human characters, some of the monsters' designs were also ridiculously cool, especially the ones that appear later on. Regarding the CGs, however, while not bad, I got the feeling they weren't always drawn with the text box in mind, which occasionally resulted in some visual details being obscured by it. In addition, the regular CGs weren't exactly numerous when compared to the H ones, with what was probably a 20-hour gap between the first batch and the next. As far as the audio department is concerned, well, let's start with the positives. I found that the soundtrack fitted the setting perfectly, delivering exactly the kind of music you would expect in a Western film. There was one track, however, that drove me nuts, where they added a metronome beat ticking off tempo over the rest of the music. Aside from that, the rest of the OST was solid. The voice acting, too, was excellent, with perfect casting across the board. There's unfortunately one major issue. The game is only partially voiced. While saying it's partially voiced feels a bit misleading, I think it's more accurate to describe this game as barely voiced. There were long stretches where I didn't hear a single voice line outside of the H scenes. This isn't exactly uncommon for some of Liarsoft's earlier visual novels. As far as I remember, Kusarihime was also like this. But with Angel Bullet, it particularly stings due to how amazing some of the performances were, particularly Sara's. For me, this is the main factor that holds the game back from achieving true greatness. To conclude, Angel Bullet is a game that certainly lives up to its unique premise. The blend of comedy, action, and mystery that it offers is only elevated by its commitment to historical authenticity. This is the type of story that makes you want to look up all the little references it makes. Not because they are vital for understanding the plot, but rather because of how convincingly integrated into the narrative they are. Furthermore, the gradual shift into its heavier and darker themes feels like a natural evolution of the narrative, which is supported by the diverse cast and their unconventional personal bonds. Perhaps the one aspect where this game falters is in its production values, in particular, the minimal voice acting. This ended up being a hindrance to the emotional impact of some scenes, especially when taking into account how fantastic some of the performances are. Despite these minor shortcomings, the game still delivers where it matters, presenting a satisfying experience for those looking for a distinctive and slightly nonconformist visual novel. I give Angel Bullet an 8 out of 10. And that wraps up the review. I guess I should also warn you that the game is by no means easy to read, with plenty of obscure words being used here and there. Although this is perhaps not exactly surprising considering that Christianity is a recurring theme in this narrative. If you have ever come across a fragment of one of the earlier Japanese translations of the Bible, you probably know what I mean. It's amusingly chuny. Still, if you ask me, I thought the quality of the writing was fairly good. Anyway, as always, thanks for watching. Marin out. On second thought, before ending this, I just want to give you a brief glimpse of the performance of Sarah's voice actress.
そんなことできるかバカ